Welcome to another in our series of podcasts from the Mary Rose Museum. We're going to be sitting in the boardroom at the museum itself, socially distanced, windows open, the museum closed. A closure caused by a worldwide pandemic. COVID-19 has had devastating effects on all our lives. The UK has succumbed to a large death toll, and that has led to comparisons being made with past pandemics. 100 years ago, just after the First World War, this country, indeed much of the world, was hit by what has been known since then as the Spanish flu. This too was a worldwide pandemic. It too killed millions, not least of all because medicines and practices of the day were not as advanced as they are now. And of course, there has been much conversation too about the older historical epidemics, the Black Death, the Great Plague, which appeared in the 14th and 17th centuries in their most deadly and widespread outbreaks. So what of the time of the Mary Rose, Tudor times? Well, there was a Tudor pandemic too, or more accurately an epidemic, curiously seeming to only really attack England, and in fact some say only the English. The Tudors in fact called it the English sweat or the sweating sickness, which also gives us a clue as to some of the symptoms. Henry VIII is said to have spent almost every night of 1528 sleeping in a different bed to avoid the likelihood of catching it, though he may have had other reasons too for a little bit of bed hopping. In any case, according to contemporary accounts, some of those who contracted this disease were dead in just a matter of hours. Sounds nasty. To find out more about this deadly disease, Tudor medicines and treatments, as well as how that relates to the Mary Rose and some of the fantastic objects in the collection, I'm going to be talking to the Mary Rose's head of research and curator, Alex Hildred, and Diane Budden, whose doctorate at the University of Winchester researches coping strategies and caring for the sick in the 16th century, specifically among seafaring and south coast communities. Hi Alex and Diane.
Hi. Hi Adrian.
Hi, good to see you. So the sweating sickness, it does sound quite a nasty little beast, but let's begin by setting some context, I think. Let's talk a little bit first about Tudor medicine in general. What did they know? How did they treat disease?
Well, the first thing to say, Adrian, is that illness and disease was a constant threat at that time. They also thought of the body in a different way, whereas we think of the body as a set of systems, digestive system, cardiovascular system, enclosed by the skin. They thought of the body as a mass of fluids with organs, some organs they were aware of, the heart, the liver, and the brain, inside it. And these humours, fluids as they called them, had to be kept in balance in order to maintain health.
And how did they sort of try and keep that balance then? What were their methods for maintaining the balance of the four humours?
Well, each of those humours, be it yellow bile, black bile, blood or phlegm, had a different quality. That means that sort of phlegm was wet and cold. So if you presented with a cold, you needed some treatment to balance that out, perhaps something that was hot. So pepper would be given to help with coughs and colds. So it was a case of balancing the humours. And they also did that by thinking of 6 factors, which they classed as non-naturals. So what you ate, the air that you breathed, the sleeping and exercise that you carried out, the passions, the emotions, and everything had to be kept in balance and kept in moderation. So you had to, say for exercise, avoid exhaustion.
So what type of people were treating these diseases? I've heard of physicians and barber surgeons. Take us through who these people were.
Well, certainly you had physicians who at this time were trained at Oxford and Cambridge, but they were quite expensive. So for the normal people, you had barbers who practiced surgery, and they would be either working with the Company of Barbers or the Fellowship of Surgeons, and you had grocers selling spices, and they became apothecaries. And you also had barbers practicing on board ships as well.
So that's what we know about the Mary Rose. There's always been the barber surgeon, or possibly even two, on the Mary Rose, Alex. Is that right?
Yes, and in fact, for the Mary Rose, we've got, at the beginning of her life, 1513, we actually have her listed with a named surgeon, Mr. Robert Simpson, and his servant, who we think is an apprentice, Henry Young. And we know that throughout the period of the life of the Mary Rose, so the active life, 1513 to 1545, that the ship did have surgeons, but we don't necessarily know the names. So we've got accounts of money being paid for surgeons, but we don't have their names. So that's a real challenge. And interestingly, at both ends of the life of the Mary Rose, we have accounts of what would appear to be an epidemic or a plague during the campaign in France in 1513. And then at the end, just after the Mary Rose sinks, we have John Lisle, who's the admiral of the fleet at the time, writing saying that there is a huge disease amongst all of the crew of the various ships, and if we don't get on top of it, we're actually going to have more people coming in. So it's very much close to the Mary Rose story. It's
so as Diane said, though, there's obviously disease is a constant in Tudor times. It's not like we're just experiencing now this one big pandemic that's killing millions around the world. They were living with horrible diseases all the time.
Yes, they were. And of course, they didn't classify them as we do today. So they called them the sweat, the pox, they had pestilence and plague. And pestilence and plague is referred to quite a lot. But for instance, the records we have identify 36 surgeons sailing with the Army by Sea at that time.
The Army by Sea is what Henry called his navy, wasn't it?
His Army by Sea.
His Army by Sea.
So
what we would call the Royal Navy now, effectively.
Yes.
But it was taking troops to do a land battle as well, although there were some skirmishes off the French coast, and in fact Mary Rose is important in that. But basically they were transporting troops, and you can see that with the inventory of armaments that are given with them. There are lots of things that are only used in land battles. So, and later throughout the period, it develops more into sea battles.
As we know.
Yes, and there was a sea battle in 1513 just off the coast of Brittany, where the Cordillere and the Regent got tangled together, and there was a huge explosion and fire, and there was a lot of loss of life. The Mary James, a ship next door, close by, I should say, suffered a lot of damage, and a lot of the men were injured. Indeed, Henry VIII pays the captain of the Mary James £30 because the sailors aren't able to sail anymore. So he pays £30 for them to travel home, and he gives them £20 as a reward to help with their injuries.
That sounds like a huge sum of money.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
National Archives was the place to find out.
well, this isn't about money, this is about disease, so we won't go into that, but it's interesting that they should feel that they need some form of recompense for the injuries that
yes,
incurred.
And it's just after that Thomas Howard becomes Lord Admiral, and he then assigns these surgeons to the ships, and the Mary Rose surgeons and the Peter Pomegranate surgeons work for the longest duration, that of 6.5 months on the ships during that period. We're not quite sure where they came from, although some of the surgeons, such as John Knott, had been in the company of barbers in London. He had been a master there. So he's obviously a barber practicing surgery rather than a specific surgeon. And the barbers practicing surgery did offer treatments using various simples and concoctions of herbs and spices as recommended by Italian surgeons at the time, such as John Vigo.
And in fact, we found bits of those. We found pepper in people's personal pockets, so whether they were carrying their own ability to cure themselves of whatever they might get.
So is that where the peppercorns on the showcase are from?
That's
They're
right.
personal
So we
possessions for the purpose of treating disease.
Well, we don't know, but you can say they might be. You know, if you were wealthy enough to have pepper in your pocket, you also would know about these treatments, because you know any one of the people that you would go to would use these treatments for it. So, and then looking at the environmental samples that are found, so that's not necessarily pepper, but it could be different bits of pollen that you get when you sieve an environmental sample. Within some of those, we've had many of the other spices that are used. So it's almost as though if you had a really good curry, that it would solve all your problems. So and we were finding those within the assemblage of the Mary Rose, as well as things like this idea that air was noxious. I mean, the air transmitted. Now we're wearing masks. And you can see in some of the paintings, you've got ladies that bring up there that are wearing handkerchiefs, just like our bandanas, if you like, of the time, and also carrying things like pomanders, because of the smell. If you've got noxious air, you've got a smell. And again, we've got 2 pomanders which do that. So it was obviously understood that there were problems.
Yeah. So they believed the body was a mass of fluids, but the skin was really porous. So it meant you were very susceptible to changes in the air, and they believed disease was passed by through the air. So of course, as Alex said, smells were very important to them, and getting rid of smells. John Vigo recommends, clearing the air and wafting around mint and lavender.
Fascinating, isn't it? And so let's drift slightly more specifically then towards the sweating sickness. There was a wonderful quote, I think from the Venetian ambassador, about how quickly it killed, which I thought was quite fascinating. He says, where have we got it? Here it is. This disease makes very quick progress, proving fatal in 24 hours at the furthest, and many are carried off in 4 or 5 hours, which obviously is pretty quick from contracting the disease to passing away. What do we know about the sweating sickness?
Well, the sweating sickness attacked in 5 different waves, they believe. The difficulty is that we think of diseases as specific set of symptoms and signs, and of course we understand the microbial background, or be it bacterial or viral. But of course in the 16th century they didn't understand that, and so they gave different terms to what we would consider the same disease. So they used the term pestilence, plague, great mortality, the sweat, as you mentioned. Now, they believe that there was these 5 outbreaks, but it's very difficult to look back at them over the time period, and some of other instances may have been the sweat, or it may have been another disease. It's very difficult to tell. John Dudley, who is the Lord Admiral in 1545, talks about illness in the ships, and he said so this is August 1545, just after the Mary Rose has sunk, there is a great disease fallen amongst the soldiers and mariners in almost every ship, and there's swelling in their heads and faces, in their legs, and divers of them have the bloody flux. And then he goes on later to say the great heat and the corruption of their victual by disorder in the provision, and strait and warmth lying in the ships. So possibly that's more of a dysentery type disease, but it is quite difficult to...
Yes, presumably their record keeping isn't like ours today, so as you say, everything could meld into one almost, perhaps.
Yes, definitely.
But interesting to think how, if you were a Tudor person, you might describe our current pandemic. What would you describe it in? Because people have different, some people lose their sense of smell, some people get dizziness before, some people have long COVID. You could have a similar way of describing it. Would you call it dysentery? Some people had poor stomachs, or just a fever.
Absolutely. Difficult to know, isn't it?
Difficult to know.
Very much.
Okay. And presumably we can't really know about the total death toll of the sweating sickness, because all the numbers would be again lumped into other plagues and agues of the time.
And it's very difficult to know what the population of, say, Portsmouth was at a particular time, because we don't have the records. So we don't have a baseline to then say that there was so many deaths and there was this mortality rate. Having said that, in 1545, it's not only the ships of the English army by sea that are suffering from plague and pestilence, but also the cities of Calais and Boulogne, which the
major
English,
outstations.
yes, which the English hold at that time, they are suffering from pestilence as well. And there is one point in the end of August where the Council of Boulogne reports back to Henry VIII, and they say, well, the plague has well ceased, and now the number of people dying per day is only 3, and they have done for the last 5 or 6 days. But obviously they were used to much greater death rates.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, as we have been over the last year or so.
Absolutely. Yes. Daily.
Which again brings us back, actually, doesn't it, to the fact that they are used to living with these horrible diseases on a daily basis.
But also the transportation part of it, because Boulogne and Calais, you had regular transports to England, ship transports to England. So, in the same way as people who go over aircrafts have brought our, COVID-19 to us.
And as Alex says, I mean, if you look at the beginning of July, there's a report from the Council of Boulogne that says they've discharged 211 sick men out of the garrison to England because they can't fight, because they've got the plague. So those men will leave France and they will come back to England.
Yeah, bringing it with them. Thank you very much.
And in fact, during the excavation of the Mary Rose, because we knew that traditionally a surgeon might treat very ill people in the hold. You take them down, even though his cabin was on the main deck, the main gun deck between 2 guns. And we found so many bodies within the hold of the Mary Rose when we excavated it, so many skeletons, that one of the ideas was that many of them were ill and were being treated by were put down there for isolation and for treatment. Now, we can't say whether that's true, because the evidence on the skeletons, those, doesn't exist, but, it was a thought at the time.
Yeah.
And as Alex said, and we mentioned earlier, there was the reference to all of the ships of the English Army by Sea having sick on them at that time.
Yeah, incredible. Now, we've got a table full of objects here, Alex, so there are obviously some things that were found in the Mary Rose that are relevant to barber surgeons and treatment of disease. Would you like to talk us through a small selection of them? Because they're fascinating to look at, some of them. I can see this saw in front of me, which is rather scary.
That is an amputation saw. So obviously the surgeon was, one of the main things was amputation. I don't know whether, Diane, you can elaborate on that and how you would use it.
No anaesthetic, was there?
No, unfortunately not. Although sometimes they did use a substance called dwale, but we don't.
What about henbane? What did that?
That was part of dwale. Yes. So they'd look for herbs and spices that act as soporifics. That is, they'd induce drowsiness. But we don't know whether they used that on the Mary Rose. But yes, there were handles for potentially an amputation saw, an incision knife, so that if there was injuries on large limbs, they could amputate those limbs. And they would use a tourniquet. Now, this is, of course, just before Paré recommends using ligatures and to tie off blood vessels. And so bleeding from an amputation hemorrhage would be quite a considerable threat.
Yeah, splattering everywhere.
But also, one of the most intriguing things was what we think would have been a handle for a trepanned. So, I don't think we're suggesting brain surgery on board, but, perhaps in order to get out things like, arrowheads or whatever, you might want to drill a little bit of the way. And there are 2 syringes on our table there. We think those are for irrigation of wounds and possibly treatment of venereal disease, would that be?
Yes. Unfortunately, a lot of the sailors, soldiers and mariners did have venereal disease at the time. So they, as Alex says, they used wine and vinegar to irrigate wounds as well, and remove fluids such as pus if they accumulated in wounds.
One of the small bowls there is pewter, and it's about the size of a cereal bowl, but with some interesting handles on it that are very flat handles. And we think that's possibly a bowl for bleeding.
For bloodletting?
Yes, for bloodletting.
Yeah.
Exactly. If you're going to balance the humours and the surgeon believes that you have too much blood, then you have to release, get rid of some of the blood. So you'd cut a vein and allow it to flow out. And it was, phlebotomy was a really common procedure, bloodletting at that time. But that pewter bleeding bowl also has the initials on the little handles at the end.
WE,
Yeah. So when we go back to the surgeons who were assigned to the Army by Sea in 1513, there were 2 on the Mary Rose and there were 2 on the Peter Pomegranate. Now, the 2 on the Peter Pomegranate were John Barker and William Elves. If he was really young when he was on the Peter Pomegranate, it's 30 years when the Mary Rose sinks. Could he have been the surgeon that was on the Mary Rose?
Wow.
We've looked in other places and not come across his name yet. So that's something which further investigations required. But it's interesting to think.
It could be though, isn't it?
Could be, yeah.
It could be, because there's so few names, aren't there, Alex, of people on board the Mary Rose?
Yeah, so few names, and obviously finding the surgeon, and it's unbelievable that you can't find the name, because so many vessels have got lists with which name the people, and we know how much they were paid, and we know from the pay list how important the surgeon was within the crew. So you've got in rates of pay the captain, the master, so that's the sailing master in charge of the sailing of the ship, the pilot, who is important for his knowledge of getting into ports and various other things, as one would have a pilot now. You usually pay for a local pilot when you come into a port. And the surgeon was next, and that was above the cook, the boatswain, the quartermaster, or any of the gunners. So, he was pretty highly paid, and it's,
And it's from those records of the accounts that have survived that we have the names of the surgeons that were working in the 1513 battles. But yet we don't have any information for 1544 and 1545.
But we still are finding things. I mean, these digitization projects, do throw up the most amazing things from tiny libraries where you don't expect to find anything, and then you suddenly get a misfiled list and further information. So, perhaps that's something that will come out of these everything being digitized or trying to be digitized at the moment.
Yeah. So, have we got any examples of surgical instruments from the Mary Rose? You mentioned the bowl and the saw and the syringe, but are there any what we might call scalpels or anything like that?
Well, there was a small leather pouch which we believe would have held fleams. Well, fleams are like blades or lancets that could have been used for bloodletting.
You've got needles for stitching things, so you've got stitching and bandaging. We've got lint bandages which were impregnated with certain things to be able to put on. We've got all of these containers, these turned wooden, there are 11 turned wooden containers within the barber surgeon's chest. And then the other things that we've got relate to the barber, now whether he's the same person or whether it was his assistant or whatever, but we've got basically cutthroat razors, and we've got the leather strap that they would have been sharpened on, and we've got a large bowl, about the size of a big salad bowl, but it's made of copper alloy, which has a little cut out of it, like a semicircular area relieved out of the rim so that you could lean on it and put your chin over it and have a shave on board.
Yeah.
So we do have evidence of the practice of both, and bone ear scoops, which we think would to take. Possibly the idea would be to put the gunners might put wax in their ears because of the noise of the gun, a little bit of wax maybe to clear it out, beeswax, and we found evidence of beeswax.
And going back to balancing the humours, of course, diet was important and food and drink were important. And we have a feeding bottle, which I know Alex...
my favourite.
Yeah, it's Alex's favourite object. But there's a really interesting story as well about finding that feeding bottle, because it's the earliest one?
It's the earliest one. I think there's a pewter one which is slightly later from a collection in London. But when it first came up, it wasn't obvious because it was obviously covered in silt. It wasn't obvious that the screw lid came off. And either the very end of it, you couldn't see the hole in it. And it went through entire conservation without being able to take the lid off and look at it and realise it was a feeding bottle. And it was only afterwards, when it was being looked at by a specialist, when the entire lot of objects that related to medicine were being looked at, that the diagnosis was made that it was actually a bottle for feeding people with very bad facial injuries that couldn't take things with a spoon. We also found a maple wood spoon within the chest, which would have been used to feed patients that couldn't take solid food. So it really is quite a good kit. You've got things for grinding, mortar and pestle. You've got a large ham mallet, which presumably would have helped with amputation with chisel in order to chisel through the bones
and things.
To chisel. And we know that there were fractures, so we've got about 30 fractures within the Mary Rose. A couple of them seem to be during the sinking, where
in the human remains.
Within the human remains,
Wow.
So we've got 107 remains of 179 of the 500 crew, and 92 of those can be partially reconstructed, and it's those that you look at to try and get information about the bodies, or about their lives, and we can pick up things like the evidence on their bodies of vitamin C deficiency in the past, and also vitamin D deficiency. But it's harder to see what was happening at the time. So our people in the hold, for example, we can't tell whether they were suffering on their bodies, or what's left of their bodies, from a plague of some sort. I think one of the nicest things and the most personal things is that this lovely silk velvet cap that was an object that came out of the chest quite early, and you unfold it and realise this was worn by the surgeon. This is a surgeon's cap.
This is the barber surgeon's cap.
Well, this is
there it is.
There it is.
So
there was a second one as well, wasn't there? The second one, a linen one. So whether that was a liner for it, but this has got a silk lining. So
it looks beautiful as well.
It is. It's highly ornate, and it's exactly the same as the one that's shown in the Holbein painting of the
So when
surgeons.
Henry VIII was very involved with his surgeons and physicians in bringing together the Company of Barbers and the Fellowship of Surgeons, which were the two organisations at the time, and he brought them together in 1540 into one organisation, the Company of the Barber Surgeons. And it's from that time we start to see people referring to them as barber surgeons, although, as I said earlier, the terms are used throughout the period. But it's a wonderful painting.
Intriguingly, it's got names on it as well.
Yes.
It's got the names of the people. So it's Henry VIII, and on either side of him are his barber surgeons, many who are wearing hats like this. And you've got a name above each of them. And at first, when we saw this, we were looking at it thinking, we're going to find a WE. And of course, we just didn't
find a WE. No.
Our elusive surgeon is something for historians or archaeologists of the future to find.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, we've drifted slightly from the sweating sickness, but I think we kind of knew we always would, because as you've said, Diane, there was not so much of a definition between all the diseases, but it's fascinating stuff, and having a look at all of these objects, it's amazing. Is there anything else that either of you want to add that brings us into the realms of COVID-19? Are there any comparisons between the sweating sickness and COVID? Do we know anything about that? Or?
Well, I think the fact that it was at the time, we've got references to people avoiding other people and shunning the town.
Yes.
And if somebody has suffered and died, things like burning all their clothes or burning the straw of their bed and things like that. So you do know that they were taking similar precautions and distancing themselves. I mean, I'm not saying it's as far as a national lockdown or anything, but there was this.
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
So you have Wolsey introduces in 1518 some guidelines for London to keep your distance, stay within your house, and it's been recently suggested that Wolsey got that idea from guidelines that they'd issued at Windsor. So they were trying to get people to social isolate. In their case, they had a large pole as well that they used to carry around with them to keep their distance.
Interesting comparisons. The correlations are interesting as well. Earlier you mentioned the ladies wearing masks, effectively, face coverings. So it's sort of full circle, really, aren't we?
Yes.
Alex, Diane, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating stuff. It's brilliant, and seeing all the objects too. Hopefully the museum will open soon. I think scheduled date is for May sometime, isn't it? So everyone will be able to come down and have a look. But thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Adrian.
Thank you very much.
I hope you have enjoyed our wander through Tudor diseases and their treatments. The objects we referred to are just a small selection of those relating to the barber surgeon on board the Mary Rose and form part of the only collection of its type in the UK from that period. To look after those and all the other objects in the museum, and of course the ship itself, the museum still needs your support. So do please feel free to make a donation, which you can do on the website. You can also buy advance tickets to visit for when we reopen, although at this moment in time we still don't have an exact date for reopening. Following government guidance, we hope the museum will be able to reopen in mid-May. In the meantime, of course, you could have a listen to the other podcasts we've produced. For now, please stay safe and well, and we look forward to welcoming you into the museum when the doors reopen.